He did it.
Got it. And let me hit record. Okay, I'd like to call the Town of Rochester CBA to order, and we'll start with pledge allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, liberty and justice for all. All right. So we only have one thing on our agenda today, which is the continued Jameson area variance application and the public hearing, which we held open last time. So just a quick reminder to folks here and then just to the board, this is an area variance to put up a shed on a vacant, it's like a 2.3 acre parcel in the R2 zoning district. Went to the code enforcement office for a permit for the shed. Since there's no principal use on that property, it required the variance, which is why we're here. We reviewed some maps. Last meeting we had some members of the public offer comment. The main thing that was commented on was that there was a desire to have some clarification on where property lines were. And then there's also some concerns about like just the road and access safety. Since the meeting, the last meeting and the public comments, spent some time both talking to our attorney and then also just looking at the maps. It's my sense that there's not currently an active dispute about where the property lines are, that everyone agrees that the Jameson property does not have access to the private road. It just has frontage on Sampsonville. The applicant agrees with that. That's what's reflected on their survey. I think the source of confusion is that the county parcel viewer version of the map is not accurate, does not match the survey. Everything that's been submitted officially to this board does match a recently done survey. Also, if you look at the property lines on some other maps online, they do not reflect the accurate location of the boundaries and the private road. The other comment was about road safety. I mentioned this last time, but I again just checked with our attorney. It's her belief, her advice to us is that there's nothing related to the road access that's before this board. Any questions of access or safety are not directly germane to what we're looking at. So with that said, does anyone on the board have any questions just amongst ourselves before we reopen the public hearing for today? Okay, so we'll reopen the public hearing. If anyone has anything to speak, just a reminder you're speaking to the board, not to each other. We don't want to have a question and answer session, but once the public hearing is done, if there's things that we can clarify, we'll try to do that. And try to limit comments to land use stuff and keep them, as brief as is practicable for you. So with that, is there anyone who'd like to speak on this application? Sir?
You don't mind that I approach the board?
Sure.
My name is Bob Baker. Former resident of the town of Rochester, actually former supervisor of the town of Rochester. That's neither here nor there. I'm representing my wife, Carol, and her sister, Nancy, and the middle on this side, are the, let's say, de facto owners of the Crum property, which is the adjoining property to Jameson. They have prepared a letter stating their concerns, and I have sufficient copies here that each of you can have. If you pass it around, each of you would have a copy. I think there's one there also. Right, one of them has an original signature. The other has all copies. If that makes any difference. So what I'd like to do would be to read the letter and then perhaps elaborate on a few of the points that they make in the letter. And then if you folks have any questions, certainly we would happy to address them. Again, this is from Carolyn Baker and Nancy Stryker. First of all, we wish to express our appreciation for the board's postponement of any action concerning the subject matter at your previous monthly meeting. As previously reported, we are sisters of the late Burton Crum. I already spoke about that, and the beneficiaries and co-executors of his estate. As such, the property is under our control and is our responsibility. Our concerns in relation to this application are as follows. We are aware that our brother and Ms. Jameson had a disagreement as to the boundary of a portion of their adjoining properties. Subsequent to our brother's death and in our absence, Ms. Jameson has constructed a wire fence along what she apparently claims to be the property line. Our deed clearly states the property line in that area follows a stone wall. Regrettably, that fence intrudes approximately 6 feet beyond the remnants of that stone wall onto our property. Unfortunately, our surveyor was recently involved in an automobile accident and is currently incapacitated. Just to clarify a little bit on that paragraph, as you know, we had requested, well, prior to the initial public hearing a month ago, that you folks adjourn this because we had become aware of it. And the only thing that we were aware of at that time is that there was an application to put this structure on a piece of a portion of the Jameson property, and we could not determine just where we were looking to locate that. And knowing that it had come to, that it was sent to the zoning board for a potential variance, and with the knowledge that we had at that time, saying, what could it be going to the zoning board for a variance for? And the only thing I could think of was because it was too close to the property line. Subsequent to that, then we found out that the town codes had changed. I guess it's about 5, 6, 7 years ago, something like that. We have this issue that you are addressing at the present time. Ms. Jameson's application is accompanied by a sketch depicting the proposed building on tax parcel, you know what the number is. The tax map wrongfully shows the southern end of her property extending to said, or extending to and including Golden Lane. And Mr. Chairman, you just addressed that, clarified that. I'll just read the letter then as it is stated. This is not the case. We are concerned with the proposed building, if constructed as shown in this sketch, would actually be on our property or at the least within the established setback limitation. As I said, you've addressed that and everybody's in agreement on that. There is still a dispute of where that property line, not that particular line, but the other line adjacent to that, where that is, where that line actually lies. But that's, I don't believe that's among your anything you need to make a decision on, of course. Okay, in regards to the town of Rochester's setback requirements, we doubt that the proposed building could be properly situated on this area of the parcel, even if it indeed were on her land. We note that setbacks, according to the town code, differ according to whether the structure is a principal or accessory building. However, section 140(13)(c)(1) stipulates that an accessory structure exceeding 200 square feet must meet the setbacks for a principal structure. The proposed structure as shown is 12 by 24 feet or 288 square feet. Therefore, a 12-foot wide structure with a front setback of 35 feet and a rear setback of 40 feet would require a minimum lot depth of 87 feet. The deed for this parcel indicates the distance along the southern end of the parcel to be 81.27 feet, as measured from the center of Sampsonville Road. setbacks obviously are not measured in the center of the road. And in conclusion, we would point out the obvious. This Jameson's parcel is, as is listed on the deeds, I think it's plus or minus 2.5 acres. There is more than sufficient room to locate this proposed structure on the northern end of the parcel rather than the southern end, which actually would be directly across the road from her residential parcel. And of course, this is signed by Carolyn and Nancy. The only thing that our main concern was that it's going to be approved before we were able to get up there and secretly a vote. And that if it was as indicated on the tax map that was accompanying the application, if the building were to be located there, it's very likely, as indicated in here, that it could be either on our property or my wife and sister-in-law's property, or relatively close to the property line, and certainly not meet the setback requirements. In the absence of that, now I'm not speaking for my wife and my sister-in-law at this point. I say personally, my opinion, it's her property. If he wants to have a structure there, and you folks agree with it, it's her property. Nothing more needs to be said about that, as far as I'm concerned. But like I said, our concern was that it was going to be approved before we had a chance to get up here and state our concerns. I think that covers it.
Mm-hmm. Do you mind if I ask a question just about I guess it's the eastern, sorry, let me orient myself, the property, the boundary between your property, the Crom property, and Jameson property. You're saying your deed indicates that the property line follows the remnants of the stone wall?
Yes, correct.
Okay. That's what
it follows the stone wall.
Yeah, and then it's
Whatever number of feet it is.
right.
Now that stone wall is still in existence for the majority of that.
Right, it's kind of like 2/3 in the middle.
As it gets down towards the end, there's, if you know what you're looking for, you can see that there's remnants, what appears to be remnants of a stone wall.
Okay, yeah, that matches what's shown on this survey that we have. That's relatively recent.
And I would point out also that the Jameson survey in that area does not mention the stone wall at all. It just says that it follows the Crom line.
Okay.
The one that we have, well,
the
the stone wall is indicated.
It's indicated on the survey, but the deed might not.
The deed does.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I think actually, if you even want to just peek at this quickly to see if it looks, just because it's important to make sure there's not an active dispute about where the property line is. I don't think there is.
Yeah, okay.
And then it says remains of a wire fence.
Yeah,
That seems right. Okay. Where they built a new fence, that's a separate question, but
I understand.
yeah, but we all agree on this, that this survey matches everyone's understanding. Okay, great. Is there anyone else who would like to comment, or did you have anything further to say?
I think you covered.
Anyone else have any comment today? Okay. Oh, if the board agrees, I think we can close comment. So I'll make that motion. Someone want to second that?
I'll second it.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Anyone opposed? Okay, so the public hearing is now closed.
Just a point of order question.
Yeah.
Did you hear from the applicant? Their attendance?
No, I emailed them in the absence of a secretary. I'm not sure. Yeah, I emailed to the email address that I had. I did not have a phone number. I also didn't stick one out. They don't have to be here. So I feel like we should at least start, I mean, I think we can probably make a decision tonight, but we should all talk and make sure we're comfortable with that. Maybe we should just start by going around and seeing what people's thoughts are. Harley, you want to start?
I mean, I don't see a problem with it, but they have to meet setbacks.
Yeah.
So regardless, I mean, by their own survey, you can see that they wouldn't meet setbacks in
In that
that
location.
location. So, and I've been driving by a little bit, taking a look at, the whole thing is fairly flat. I mean, trying to move it up would be, as long as they meet setbacks, I don't see why they can't put a building there.
Clay?
I have to agree with that. I think the caveat would be that the setbacks are properly met. They're trying to put in, it's almost like it's not even a permanent structure. There's no foundation. It's a shed. Okay, I understand it still doesn't meet the requirements, it requires a variance. But you're dealing with something that still is not as permanent as we would think. Okay, it's not going to be anchored to the ground. I mean, this doesn't give them the authority to run electric to it and stuff like that. So it could still be moved. Okay. And it doesn't seem like it's overwhelmingly something that the public would be against, even the surrounding landowners. I think their biggest concern is, once again, like you probably said, the setback issue, as long as it meets those requirements. As far as the fence, that's a topic, unfortunately, we can't decide on. That's a fantasy. That's I mean, you handle that how you have to through the law and everything else. But that's where I stand.
Charlie?
We've had other ones where had accessory buildings on them, and we denied them because it says you can't put an accessory building on a property, just on a principal building on it. Myself, I'm against it for that reason.
Ken?
Sean, I'm trying to remember, we had this discussion previously about whether or not the variance, what it would require to have the variance for an accessory building without being attached to a principal building. And it had struck me at the time that it was more in the realm of a usage variance than an area variance, but I think it was clarified that it actually is considered an area variance. It's kind of like adding something to zero.
Yes, I mean, that was the other thing that I talked to the attorney about, was just confirming that this is appropriately considered an area variance. And what she said is yes, but it's sort of like a special kind of area variance because it's an allowed accessory use, right? Tool sheds are an allowed accessory use without a permit in the district. But it's just like, it's like an order of operations thing. It's like if someone wanted to build their garage before they built their house, the code enforcement could say, well, a garage is an accessory to a residential use, so you can't have the garage before you have the house unless you get an area variance. And it's sort of like an order of operations
I'd
variance.
love to see an example where somebody putting accessory building on a property that doesn't have the first building not be for accessory use.
I mean, I think I've seen them, but
It's just not putting anything in there, just having, storing the building, maybe I think would be the only example of that.
Sorry, I'm not sure that I follow what you're.
What's happening is you're saying that it's not a use variance. Okay, so give me an example of where an accessory building wouldn't be used for something. So it's always going to be.
I think it's a question of a use variance, as I understand it, means you want to do something in an area where it's not permitted under
Okay.
the zoning.
Yeah.
Okay,
Is that-
I'm
is that right?
reading it as though they want to operate, mechanics business out of the shed,
Right,
so
that would be a use variance.
Right.
So it's an area variance, and Charlie, my instinct is I'd agree with you, but for the fact that we have our attorney saying we can consider it as an area variance, so that's why I'm referring.
Why I based what I said. I
Yeah.
thought it was going to be strictly area, not use.
It's just area, but it's like, it's that whole thing where there's this tendency to think of things in percents or like how much of a variance is it? And in this case, it's hard to think of it that way. Because in one sense, it's 100% area variance because they're building something that they can't have because there's no principal use. But in the other sense, it's a 0% area variance because you're completely allowed to have a shed if you have a principal use. And you can also in this,
If you have a principal use.
if you have a principal use, but also some of the principal uses that are allowed don't actually require any sort of structure. For example, agricultural, non-animal agriculture is allowed as a principal use in this zone. Animal agriculture is allowed as a principal use. Also, cellular telecommunications facilities are allowed, right? So if all of those things, which would be greater impact, are allowed as a principal use, but are not residential uses. So like if they got a horse and instead of this being a shed for tools, if this was, oh, the shed for the horse, then no variance would be required.
Or believe that the applicant indicated or the daughter indicated she was using it for some kind of
Yeah.
a quasi gardening agricultural.
So we did actually kick it informally back to code enforcement and said, would you be open to considering agriculture as the principal use here? Because our town's definition of agriculture, as some of you may know, is fairly expansive. It's like anything for the production or cultivation of plants for human enjoyment or use. It's like, I'm not quoting it exactly, but it's like very broad. And the code enforcement officer says, well, you know, I've always interpreted it as you got to be like doing farming. Because he feels that if you just have a garden, that shouldn't count as a principal use. And that's his interpretation. We didn't come to us as a code interpretation. But we could, at least in my mind, a mitigating factor against substantiality here is that if this was, if someone started a mushroom cultivation operation where they were stacking mushroom logs, right? Then it would clearly be agriculture, and then they could have a shed without variance. For me, that like speaks to it feeling kind of okay. But I do hear what Charlie's saying. It's like, well,
Do you remember the circumstances, the last one being denied, Charlie? Do you remember
Yes.
that
There was a
application?
garage on it, they wanted to subdivide it, no house on it.
this was, and it was that subdivision.
Kings Highway.
Subdivision to put another building? Or-
Yeah, they wanted to subdivide the property. There was a house on the one lot, there was a garage on the other lot. They wanted to subdivide it, so the garage would be
On
separate
the
from the
same
house.
piece.
And then they were gonna build a
And
house
then they were going to build it.
Okay.
and sell the first. And it was denied. So they kept them together and then built the house.
Yeah, or didn't they like build an apartment in the garage or something?
Yeah.
So then it could be a residential use of the garage. They like reclassified it as a residential use. Yeah, that was like it was like 3 years ago or something.
Probably.
With respect to the setbacks, my concern is hypothetically,
Mhm.
if we approve the current application for a variance for the area usage, subject to meeting any setback requirements, I feel like if indeed the concerns raised by Mr. Baker have merit, judging on saying, if indeed, then we're kind of in a circular position where the applicant presumably would have to come back for an additional variance or relocate the shed.
Then this application wouldn't spell out what's needed.
So I'm just wondering, in light of the applicant not being here, what if it's efficacious really to even vote on the application today? That's kind of my concern.
Well, I think we certainly could punt to the next meeting. My inclination is to write is to go through this, see what we want to decide, and then write that in such a way that says we're not granting any setback variances in these situations. You have to reposition it against versus what you proposed. Like we could say we're in favor of, or not in favor, we're going to allow you to have a shed here, but the shed has to meet all the setback requirements. And we could just say that, and if they decide that, okay, now we want to come back for a setback variance, then they could do that. But, you know, we could indicate that we wouldn't be inclined to do that in this instance.
I mean, my inclination, I mean, we could do that, but my suggestion would be that we alert the code enforcement officer who made his decision without regards to anything to do with the setback, right? He just made an initial take on it.
He said you can't have an
You
accessory.
can't have an
without a
accessory without a principal. And kind of feed that information back to both the applicant and the code enforcement officer, in which case, if the code enforcement officer believes that there is indeed a setback issue, he can relay that to the applicant and to us, and she can decide, perhaps in consultation with the neighbors, whether or not to relocate the shed, or she can come back and try and get a variance on a combined variance on both the accessory use and the setbacks in one application. Because my concern is this, it's not a big concern. It's simply, were we to approve it, given the objections that have been made on the record, then I'm not so sure that were it to be challenged, even if we qualified it with subject, I guess if we qualify it subject to any setback requirements, then I guess the code enforcement officer could do what? Let her put the shed up and then come back and say you violated it. I mean, move it. And then, if there's no urgency to the construction of it, that's all. I'm kind of in a little bit of a quandary here.
I'm hearing that the public really doesn't mind the shed being there. It's the setback issue is the concern. Now, if this application were to change the proposed 12 by 24 gardening storage shed to farming storage shed, is what I'm hearing, then this application doesn't go forward.
You mean it wouldn't need a variance
It wouldn't need a variance.
if the code enforcement agreed that it was fine?
Yeah, that would require an appeal.
Right.
That would, in other words, if she had appealed and said, no, it's not an accessory use.
Or it is an
It's an accessory use to a permitted agriculture. Then you're right.
Well, I think it would be helpful to maybe just start going through the 5 questions that we're supposed to answer and see if that illuminates this. Like, I personally feel ready to decide this one way or the other, but
Is there an actual picture of that?
Yeah.
There's just a picture of somebody standing there with flags. You can see.
yeah, it doesn't show the location.
I didn't think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's correct. You know, we're also not approving a location.
Well, that's what I'm getting at. So
We're not approving a site
we're
plan.
not approving a site plan or an exact location, except it has to meet
Saying
setbacks.
you can get a shed of this size and put it on that property, even though it's
And
accessible.
we're allowing them to do it as long as they meet setbacks. So
Or-
they can
right.
put it
We can even give them,
wherever in that entire lot,
as long as it
as
meets,
long as they meet setback.
or if they put a smaller shed up that's less than 200 square feet. We can say like, there's no variance here to setback.
I mean, just read through their application. They didn't include a picture and then like normally you'd see.
It's not a site.
Yeah, I think we had asked.
It's also possible that something got lost in the absence of our secretary, but I don't think we ever received anything more or asked for anything more detailed than what we got. Well, so, okay, so the first question, because it sounds like we don't have total agreement. And I think just the way to get to consensus is to just answer these questions. Because that might give us clarity. Everyone feel all right about that? Okay. So the first one is whether an undesirable change will be produced in the character of the neighborhood or detriment to nearby properties will be created by the granting of area variance. Harlan?
No.
Even that's sketchy, because now what happens if a neighboring property that has wants to put a structure on and needs the same variance now, is that going to have pop-up sheds showing up everywhere? You know what I mean? So in this direct instance, no. But like Charlie says, what about the next application that we follow?
Right,
We have to consider that domino effect.
Well, I mean, that question right there
We set
is,
precedents.
you're not really setting a precedent because you're saying for that specific location. So if somebody was like 100 yards down the road, then it's not, there's not a woodlot there. There's trees, there's more housing. So that would take
be
away from
different,
it.
be different.
So I don't necessarily think we're setting, it's just fine line.
I think you're both right. I think anytime you grant,
Last time, too. They're both, he's right. And I think what I'm saying is right.
Mhm.
So, I mean,
Yeah.
I have to say yes.
Well, another frame
And that's
on
my
that,
qualifying reason.
another frame on that is just in the schedule of district regulation, right? Again, like if they were to build a house, they could build a shed, whatever size they want, as long as
That's
they meet
correct.
setback.
That's
And that, according to the zoning that's been approved by the town board, right, does not produce an undesirable change. The neighborhood allows for sheds,
right, but there's no house.
right?
So
But it's like, I guess the question is, does a shed without a house in and of itself make the shed undesirable, whereas if there was a house, it would be desirable? For me, that, I'm like, no, it doesn't make it undesirable, but that's my answer to that.
I'm comfortable with that too.
What about you? You say yes or no?
Yeah. I
You
would
think it's
I would
undesirable?
You make it undesirable. I'm just saying it's against the code.
Hmm.
We've had other ones, we denied them. They can say, no, come back if they wanted to. Say, well, you let them have it, why didn't you let us?
Because their area wasn't a desirable area for that.
Just to speak one minute on this issue of precedence. I mean, it is true that we have an obligation to consider precedents. It's not that you are necessarily bound every time to follow, a precedent absolutely, because you take each case on its back. But the general approach, I believe, is if you're going to deviate from a well-established precedent, you should have a good reason to. Which, like Holly said, in particular cases, you could assume that, well, in this location, there's really minimal impact, whereas if you did it in another location, it could be different. So, I mean, I'm kind of mindful of precedent, but it's not like I don't feel like, like I'm really handcuffed by it. So.
I have a question about that. Does anybody know what the shed's gonna look like? Wouldn't that be answered differently? The shed were something neighbors didn't like seeing?
100%. I mean, if it was a giant pink building in
Unless
that
you like
area,
pink.
in Main Street, you could get away with a pink building. There, no, that'd be horrible for all the neighbors.
I think, we don't have a specific, that's something like if we were to not decide tonight, we could ask them for a picture of what general type of shed, I think they said there's just gonna be like an Amish shed from the place in Aqua or in Kerhonkson there on 209. And I don't think the Amish make pink ones, but it's a good point.
So do we have consensus on that first point?
I'm hearing no, but there's also like no that it's not going to produce an undesirable change, but there's some caveats that we want to include in our thinking.
Yeah, it's just considered in the front yard too.
Yeah,
That's another thing. Sheds are supposed to be in the front yard, the way I understand.
Well, there's, yeah, I mean, I can read that section of the code if you guys want to hear it. So accessory structures, so this letter cites this too. Accessory structure is not attached to a principal structure, and this is 4 code 14013. I'm looking at C. And it does also say no accessory building permitted by this chapter shall be placed in any required side or front yard setback. So what I hear that is saying is you can't put it in the setback. Like the front yard is the front yard setback. So as long as it's not in the setback, it's not in the front yard. And so that's A. And then B is the side cannot be greater. The aggregate ground area covered by an accessory building in any rear yard shall not exceed 25% of the rear yard setback area. So you can't put your shed in your front yard, you can put it in your backyard setback, but it has to be below a certain size if it's in your backyard. And then C, accessory structure is not attached to a principal structure shall, 1, be located not less than 10 feet from any side or rear lot line, or in such a fashion as to, basically you can't block emergency access, and you can put it in your rear side lot, but it can't be closer than 10 feet to the property line. But then it says any structure over 200 square feet shall meet setbacks for principal structures. So basically that's what the commenters reference. Then 2, it can be no closer to the street than any principal structure on the lot, except in the case of agricultural buildings. Accessory buildings to principal structures located more than 100 feet shall be exempt. More than 100 feet from the lot line shall be exempt. Accessory structures may in these situations be located in front of residences. So if your house is really far from your yard, from the street, you can put the accessory in front of your house. If it's closer, you can. What else is relevant here? Wind turbines, not relevant. Solar energy, fences and walls. Yeah, that's it. So it's really just the setbacks apply. Did that answer that question? Sorry, I lost a little bit of track of the question we had.
Well, I think that Charlie had pointed, well, this was going back to the question of you have the shed without an accessory to anything. And we were talking about the quality of the neighborhood, and Charlie had pointed out that, well, ordinarily you wouldn't be able to have a shed in front of a building. So therefore, if it's standing out on its own, is that of any concern? Do I read that? Is it of a concern? Yeah.
Okay. So let's see, I'm saying no significant detrimental impact. And because sheds are allowed in R2 zoning, there is no detrimental impact. However, the board is mindful that there may be some circumstances where allowing an accessory use in the absence of a principal use could cause a detrimental impact. In particular, if the lot was like a bare lot, like there's no trees, black tree cover. Charlie, you were saying, or if they wanted it to be like really close to the road or something, like in a front yard setback, really close to the road. Or if an applicant wanted to or a smaller structure. Okay. So I said no detrimental impact because this type of structure is allowed in R2. However, we're mindful that there might be circumstances where allowing an accessory use in the absence of principal use could cause a detrimental impact. In particular, if a lot lacked tree cover, or if an applicant wanted to place a structure less than 200 square feet inside of a setback.
More than 200 feet.
A structure, yeah, which was, yeah, because if it's less than 200 square feet, you can put it in your rear or side setbacks. So I think, is that right with what you were saying, Charlie? Like, if it was a smaller shed, say it was 8 by 10 or something, there's only 80 square feet, they could say, oh, I want to put it 10 feet from the lot line. And that would feel more significant.
Yeah, I guess, maybe.
Okay. All right, so the second question is whether the benefits sought by the applicant can be achieved by some method feasible by the applicant to pursue other than an area variance. I mean, I can start with that one. I think, yeah, there are other things. They could combine the two properties that they own that are bordering into one, and then they wouldn't need an area variance. Also, they could do a principal use, then they wouldn't require an area variance. So yeah, I think those are feasible. There's reasons they don't want to do that are reasonable, but there are things they could do.
I agree with that.
So most definitely, there are alternatives.
Okay, so we're gonna say yes on that one.
They feel wrong.
And you might reference there that we explicitly spoke
We did.
about,
We presented that.
and they just said they didn't want to for their own economic reasons, which are reasonable, but to be acknowledged.
Or they could pursue principal use on the applicant does not. Okay, so I'm saying, yes, there are other options for them. The applicant has the option of consolidating two parcels into one, or they could pursue a principal use on the property. The applicant does not wish to pursue the option at this time. This was discussed in a public. Everyone good with that? Okay.
Just one last one, and to make sure that in this particular case, they own both parcels. There could be
Right.
other situations in which you might not have your adjoining landowner's permission, or you have to go buy the other parcel.
Two adjoining parcels that they own. That are owned. Okay. So I just said the applicant has the option of consolidating two adjoining parcels that are owned by the applicant into one, or they could pursue a principal use on the site. Okay. Whether the variance requested is substantial. You want to start on that
That's
one?
100%. Yeah, it's substantial. Yeah. Just nothing else there.
I agree with that.
Harley? Ken?
I don't see substantial as a binary thing. Again, I would say it's significant, but in the sense that an accessory use of that type would be allowed were there a principal use, again, for the reasons you stated earlier, i.e. if it was deemed to be agricultural or animals, in which case it would not be substantial at all. So you can look at the substantiality as what is the current use of that land? And as I understand it, she's using it for garden. And the variance she's seeking is to have a shed as an accessory to a gardening operation, as opposed to an accessory to something deemed like for horses. We've all spoken about. So in that sense, I don't see it as very substantial.
Yeah, I agree with Ken on that. I think I'm thinking of it that way. I totally understand. Like, I see the other perspective that, you know, it's not like we're letting someone go 1 foot over a size limit or 1 foot over a setback. We're saying like, it's a binary, like either it's allowed as an accessory or you can't use it as a principal. Like in that sense, it's a binary and we're flipping the binary in this case. But what Ken's saying, I also agree with. So maybe we can just write all of that and say like on the one hand, it's substantial because accessories can't stand alone. And if allowing this is, like a total flip of accessory versus principal. But on the other hand, it's an allowed accessory use that if circumstances were only slightly different, wouldn't require variance. Does that feel like okay to everyone? I see Clay and Charlie having a hesitation.
I think based on other decisions we've made regarding percentage of use, we're dealing with nothing to having something. Therefore, that change becomes 100% regardless of how it's going to be used, anticipated use. The ask is for a shed where there is no shed on a piece of property, where there is the shed not, the word, let me rephrase that, where the shed is not allowed to be used. Now we're going to give them, and they're asking to put this here. That's 100% change and 100% ask of the board to approve. It's not the percentage over a line. It's not the percentage on a smaller piece of property under what would normally be allowed. Okay, that's why I'm saying it's 100%. It's still a significant change. It doesn't mean that we're not going to approve it. It just means that it has to be noted as though in every case going forward, whether it be a size on a fence, 33% or 2 feet, whatever the case may be, we have to make it the same, which in this case is 100% of a change that wouldn't normally be there or allowed. That's the way I'm reading it.
So do you agree with that, Charlie? So if we said, what if we say, yes, it's substantial for the reason you just said, I think I would still want to have the, like, on the other hand, like, while we do think it's substantial, we feel like the substantiality is mitigated for the reasons Ken said.
I agree with that. We can use as a mitigating circumstance towards our decision in that question. But I think primarily should be listed as the substantial.
Answer yes. You go with that, Charlie? Yeah. Harley? Okay, so I'm gonna say yes. Trying to get your words right.
Good luck.
I'm just going to type for a second and then I'll read what I type.
There's a mitigating circumstance.
I think that's the way I think we've come to land on an acceptable thing, yeah. And I like the idea of acknowledging something that is substantial.
It shows in the future if anybody were to use this as a case. It doesn't give them latitude.
Right.
So if it could be distilled to one sentence, does the following sentence work? Because the applicant is asking to have an accessory use where there is no principal use, the board sees this as a significant variance request. Does that say it? Is there anything? I feel like maybe I'm missing a piece of that.
You're answering yes to the question, is it substantial?
Yeah, I'm saying yes.
Because
the applicant is asking to have it. Oh, I should say substantial. No, you're right.
I know, I mean, either way.
I would
know.
also, that mitigating circumstance.
Yeah, I'm gonna do that next, yeah. That one is easier for me because that was like my first impulse. However, the board also sees the substantiality being mitigated by the fact that the accessory use is allowed in the zone, and because if circumstances were only slightly different, say the shed was for a horse to use. The variance, no variance would be required. Okay, so I said, is the variance request substantial? Yes, because the applicant is asking to have an accessory use where there is no principal use, the board sees this as a substantial variance request. However, the board also sees the substantiality being mitigated by the fact that the accessory use is allowed in the zone. And because of the circumstances were only slightly different, say the shed was for a horse to use, no variance would be required. Does saying that thing about the horse, does that sound too like
It's a good example.
jocular or something?
A little concerned about because it's allowed.
Oh, because sheds are allowed as accessory use.
It's and not in every example. In this example, they're not. So be careful with that.
Let me reword that. However, the board will see the distinction by the fact that in this instance, sheds are allowed as accessory.
It can. I can see it.
No, I just,
The wheels.
I think Clay's point was to try and say not in this. So the construction of your sentence might be better. You didn't say in this.
So I said, yeah, so the board sees substantiality being mitigated by the fact that that sheds are allowed as accessory uses.
Very good.
Right.
With a primary.
As accessory uses in the zone where a primary use exists.
Okay.
And you could even say, such as an agricultural use or.
Yeah.
Use such as agriculture.
Agricultural use would be better
Rather than horses shed.
Then, yeah, penning it to one,
Okay,
because if they decide they wanna
Now they're gonna get horses.
grow flowers and raise them to sell, then it kind of
Yeah.
changes, you know.
I'm telling you, that one line is gardening to farming changes the whole application.
Yeah.
But it's up to the interpretation of.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be.
okay. As if the circumstances are only slightly different, say the shed was to support a agricultural use. Was accessory to an agricultural use. Okay, so now it says the board sees the substantiality being mitigated by the fact that sheds are allowed as accessory uses in the zone, in this zone, where a primary use such as agriculture exists. It is also mitigated because if the circumstances were only slightly different, say the shed was accessory to an agricultural use, no variance would be required. But
Okay,
we're still saying it's substantial.
okay.
Okay, fourth question. Whether the proposed variance will have an adverse effect or impact on the physical or environmental conditions in the neighborhood or district. Ken?
No,
Harley?
I'd like to know exactly what this building, like, I'd like a site plan.
Right,
For the simple fact that, you know, are they gonna cut every tree down?
right.
Are they gonna just clear out right where they wanna put the building?
Based on what they did say, their concern is protecting the trees that are there. So,
you
yeah,
see the photos?
Yeah,
There was between the big trees and there was a few saplings.
I mean, obviously, they're gonna have to cut a roadway in to be able to get this building in there.
Right. And roll it in
Pay
on
the
logs.
helicopter to airdrop it. You need to be able, you need to be able to get it. So, you know, I mean, I'd say, I guess I'd lean towards no, as long as they're not gonna destroy 2 acres of trees.
Right, in order to put a shed in. Yeah.
I agree. No, as long as there's no future extenuating circumstances or changes that they want to make.
Mhm.
Based on this application for the shed size that they're looking for, and yeah, there's no significant.
Charlie?
Yeah, I agree with you.
No? Okay, so the board feel there's no significant impact. What are they saying? Sorry. Well, there's no adverse impact from the proposed variance. so long as minimal land disturbance occurs in the installation of the shed.
They said that they put those flags when they want.
Right. Yeah, but they might not
I
be
know
able
what
to
they're
because of
doing
the
here.
setback.
That's shit.
Yeah.
Okay, number 5, whether the alleged difficulty was self-created, which consideration shall be relevant to this decision of the Board of Appeals, but shall not necessarily preclude the granting of the area variance. So whether it was self-created, Charlie? Yes.
Once again, we went over the same thing last time. If they didn't want to put the shed there, then there wouldn't be an issue. So
Yeah.
yes, they created it.
Yes.
Yes,
All right, that's unanimous. Anyone have any comments on that one? No. Okay, so we're just gonna say yes. Yes, the applicant, no one is forcing the applicant to put up a shed. It's choosing. Does that cover it? Okay, so then it's determination. I mean, I can start, but I like it better if someone else starts and then I can synthesize.
Based on what we've answered there.
Do
5 questions.
you want me to, I can review those answers
No,
too. if you
Just,
guys
just
want.
the yes or no portion. How many, just for curiosity's sake, not to make a determination based on just that, but how many yeses showed a negative yes versus a positive yes?
So we're saying no undesirable change, so that's, I guess,
That's a
positive.
Let's call that a plus.
Whether the benefit could be sought by some other means, we were saying yes, so that's
Negative.
whether it's substantial, we said yes, but we mitigated it, so it's like, still it's
It's
the
still a
yes,
yes.
we're doing the yes, no. Whether the proposed variance will have an adverse impact, we said no, so that's positive. They really should have made this so that the yeses and nos point.
Yeah.
That's what happens when the
I
state
mean,
gets
this does kind of sound silly to go over it this way, but.
right. No, it's good. And then whether it was self-created, we were saying, yes, it was self-created. So it's like
So
3
there's
to 2.
three saying that, hey, listen, you shouldn't be doing this. Okay, we really can't allow you to do this based on these questions, the way that they're answered, the way that you presented this application versus no. Based on the state's feeling and the way that the town reads this, those answers are pretty significant. They're pretty important. Okay, given that, unfortunately, I don't think the shed should be allowed. I think the application, if they want to change the application and seek some other remedy, they were presented with those options. These answers say that it should not be allowed. It should not be considered, and variance should not be granted.
Anyone else?
I'll take a shot at it. I appreciate Clay's points, but I have a slightly different take on it. And even with respect to the yeses and the nos, the second yes is the substantiality. As I indicated before, I think it's substantial insofar as it's 100%, but yet I see that as significantly mitigated by the fact that were it simply to have the same building in the same spot, and Mr. Ed could live there as a horse, it would be allowed. So I see that as equally kind of taking away from the substantiality. And with respect to the last yes, it's self-created. But as I was reading, doing some research at one point, because that struck me, almost all of the applications for a variance are self-created. The only time it isn't is when you have a change in the law so that it's beyond anything you could do. So self-creation to me is not that significant. So I look at the ones that have no substantial impact in the area, no negative impact, as being more meaningful to me on this one. However, I'm not clear exactly how I would ultimately vote on the issue, because I kind of think that there's an elephant in the room, so to speak, with respect to the setbacks. But I'm not sure yet
No.
how I'm going to ultimately vote.
Let me add to Ken's statement there a little bit too, real quick. that final question says that it may or may not be used to weigh in final decision. Basically, it's even spelled out in the question. That's why I put in there, if the applicant, based on the way that they applied now, the answer being no, but if they were to reapply under a different circumstance, I think it would have to be weighed differently. And once again, Ken's right, we do have to weigh in on the setback issue. We don't know exactly what they plan on doing. If we blanketly say, yeah, you can put this structure on that property, and then they don't put it in the right spot, we've kind of failed on their part. So it's almost leaning towards, we can't make a real true decision on this until we have more information, unfortunately.
You got anything, Harley?
I mean, in between the both of them, it's a very valid. I mean, we definitely need to. I'd like to know where they're gonna put it.
Does everyone agree on that point? Like, is that the deciding? Because I think for me, like, to put my cards, like, I'm very much a yes on this one. I feel like this is a very reasonable ask. I also kind of feel like these, I mean, this isn't germane in a technical sense, but a lot of people would have just put this shut up and not ask for a permit. And like, that's not a mitigating factor, but like, these people are doing the right thing. They're being, at least procedurally, they're like checking all the boxes. And the ask for me is reasonable and appropriate, especially considering, when I look at what the code is saying in this zoning, it's basically saying you can have a shed if you have a horse or a garden, and then there's no variance needed.
Not for a garden.
Well, our
has to be
code
for
enforcement
agriculture.
officer is saying, I can read you our definition.
Yeah, no,
So for me, when I look at all those things, I see, like, I hear about the setback point. We don't want to be through some sort of backdoor granting a setback variance, like, because I have no interest in doing a setback. But I feel like we could write that into the decision. But if everyone else is like, well, we don't even want to leave that door open. We want to grant, if we're going to grant a variance, we want it to be a very narrow variance that says this location, which we know conforms with setbacks, is the location. Like, we can do that. We can completely ask for clarification and even a more precise drawing.
The majority of their property, except for that one corner, is gonna be fine.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's how I feel, but I'm only one vote, and
Put
I'm
it
much happier if we
there,
vote
yeah.
unanimously.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Sam, I really appreciate what you said about, these people are trying to do the right thing. They're trying to follow the processes. And that's why I'm trying not to send them in circles. I wouldn't want them to go back and put a building up, we got our variance and we put the building up. Then they get the code enforcement off, the neighbors complain. And so I would really kind of like to have the issue resolved.
Right, all at
And
once. Like,
Kind
pin
of
it
all
down.
at once, and maybe it can even be done amicably, whatever. So I'd like to make a two-part motion.
Okay.
The first part is that we adjourn without making a decision, but contact the applicant to advise her that A, we desire a site plan to consider her application in light of the fact that at a public hearing, concerns were raised with respect to the setback, and that in submitting her site plan, she may want to consult with the code enforcement officer as to whether or not there would be any issue.
So basically you're saying, let's send them a letter, just saying we want it. I mean, it sounds like there was also a question of just getting in writing that it's going to be a shed that looks a certain kind of way. But we want to know where it's going to be. We can cite the setback requirements in the letter just so that it's clear. And say we just want to see a map that shows
The
distances.
impacted zone as well. I mean, if they put up even a 10 by 10 shed, which obviously would be variance, but you want to know how much, you know, how much they're actually gonna take down.
How are you gonna get in?
Change the topography of the area.
But
So the questions are,
But Sam, I'm sorry, just one other
Yeah.
thing, because if we're communicating with it, again, I really think that, you know, people come to us without lawyers, you
Yeah.
know, without engineers, they're citizens, and we ought to treat them as well as we possibly can respectfully. So I don't even know if they know that they could apply for an area use variance if they were 5 feet, you know what I mean? In other words, they could get a variance on the setback too. I don't want to say we do not consider
Right.
an application for a variance on the setback issue, but
But
they
they
ought to
didn't
go
ask for
in,
that,
yeah, they ought to go in with their eyes wide open.
Because not trying to decide for them what type of shed they're supposed to have and
Yeah.
where they have to put this thing.
Mhm.
Okay, it's still up to them to make these decisions.
Mhm.
Far be it for us to decide how they want to have their stuff. As long as it's within the guidelines of the town.
okay, so just bullet point versions of those questions are the location in relation to setbacks. So like we want to confirm, like was brought up in the comments, the only location drawing we have is just like on a not even accurate property boundary map. And it's just like a Sharpie, not to scale in any way. We want to have something that's more precise
Actual
of
measured
where they're
setbacks.
intending to put it relative to the property. Then we're just curious about the style and design of the shed. And then land clearing, or I guess tree clearing, no, it's called land clearing, required to bring in the shed. Like how, just what's their thinking about how they're gonna get, is helicopter drop
How much will it change the characteristic?
of the property to bring it in? Okay,
My personal feeling is because this is not normal thing and it's, you know, accessory building, it has to be scrutinized just that little bit more
Due diligence.
than what a normal, you know, if you were doing just a normal shed with a house there, or, because at that point you can't do anything anyway. You're kind of down, but we're gonna allow them to do it, and we need to be able to make sure, you know, we make it so it's not easy for everybody in there to just continue on and follow that path.
okay, so I'm good with that.
So that there was a motion, Ken, and then you said you had a
Well, let's
second
so
motion.
adjourn, if he wants to just.
We're done. It says we're done.
I'm not sure if there's anything more formal about that. Yeah, it was a motion.
Yeah, I mean-
Adjourn and to communicate to them.
So you think like we can, I don't think we have to vote to authorize me to just send that letter saying, you know, we're about ready to make a decision, but these things feel like sticking points. So we just want to clarify them. Also, after hearing public comment about the setback, that feels important. And we'd like answers to those questions before we make a final decision.
And
Okay, and I can just send that letter. And then that's it. We're gonna have another application on our agenda next month too, so. Have continuity,
Hopefully.
Continuity.
hopefully, yeah.
And then, that's the only other thing is whether or not. No, we've closed the public hearing, so we don't need to.
Yeah, if we were to get substantial new information, then we would have to reopen it, but I think just getting, but like, if they were sitting here, they could have clarified these questions.
Mhm.
We got 62 days to make
Yeah,
it-
so we're good.
make a
Yeah,
decision.
that's a good reminder. Okay,
Which that means they have to respond in a certain amount of time.
right, I'll let them know, and if I don't hear from them, I'll try to find a phone number. Okay, anyone else, you want to make your motion to adjourn?
Don't we have other business?
Oh, we have-
Oh, well, there's no minutes that have been prepared. And I don't have any other business. Do you have any other business?
You said another application.
Oh, no, there's one coming in, but it's not ready for that. Yeah, for next.
It's not a shed on a piece of property, that house, is it?
I don't think so. I actually don't have it in my head. I'm too busy this time of year to keep that in my RAM. It's in the hard drive, not
It's
this.
in planting mode.
Yeah. All right. Anyone else got any other business? Ken, you got any other business?
No, sir.
All right. You want to make your motion to adjourn that?
We're moving to,
moving to adjourn the whole
Yeah.
meeting,
whole
yes.
meeting. All right, I'll
Move to
second
adjourn.
that. All right, there we go. We're done.
You got a second on that?
Yeah, we got the second.